ตุกกับคุกเข่าเลยไปนั่งลง
มือไว้ครับ
เดี๋ยวทุกคนเข้าไปถวายสังฆทานกันนะครับถวายสังฆทานกันนะครับกราบพระนะครับนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะเอตานิมยังพันเตทัตตานิสัพปริวารานิสีวรันตัสสะโอโนชยามะสาธุโนพันเตสีลวันโตเอตานิทัตตานิสัพปริวารานิปฏิคันหาตุอัมหากันทีฆรตังหิตายะสุขายะข้าแต่พระคุณเจ้าผู้เจริญข้าพเจ้าทั้งหลายขอน้อมถวายซึ่งภัตตาหารกับของที่เป็นบริวารทั้งหลายเหล่านี้แด่พระคุณเจ้าขอพระคุณเจ้าจงรับซึ่งภัตตาหารกับของที่เป็นบริวารทั้งหลายเหล่านี้เพื่อประโยชน์เพื่อความสุขแก่ข้าพเจ้าทั้งหลายสิ้นกาลนานเถิด
ยะตาวะริวหาปุราบริปุเรนติสังกรังเอวเมวะอิโภติตังเปตานังอุปกปปติจิตตังปฏิตังตุมังคิปะเมวะสมิจตุสัมเปปเรนตุสังกปาจันโดปนรสุยะตามานิโจติรสุยะตาสัมปิติโยยวะจันโดสัพพะโรโกวินาศตุมาเตภวัตวันตรายโยสุขิติกาโยโกภวะอภิวาทนาสิริสานิจังวะดังปัจจายโนจาตารโอธัมมวทันติอายุวันโนสุขังบาลังภวตุสัพพมังคลังรักขันตุสัพพเทวตาสัพพพุทธานุภาเวนะสันตสุติภวันตุเตภวตุสัพพมังคลังรักขันตุสัพพเทวตาสัพพธัมมานุภาเวนะสันตสุติภวันตุเตภวตุสัพพมังคลังรักขันตุสัพพเทวตาสัพพสังฆานุภาเวนะสันตสุติภวันตุเต
ข ตักข้างหน้า
ไม่เกี่ยวแต่ลุงเขาอยากทำงานพ่อ
ไม่ต้องรอก่อน
ว่าเขาจะไม่ไปแล้ว
เพราะว่าประมาณช่วงที่ไปบอกคนสิถ้าคุณระวังประมาณแค่ไม่หลักเราจะจะมาว่าคือผู้ใหญ่อะไร
เจ๊บอกว่าเจ๊ทำไมเจ๊แต่งงาน
เทียบหมดเลย
เจ๊แล้วพี่มาเกิดเจ๊แต่งงานปัจจุบันตอนนี้เรามีเจ๊ก็เป็นเจ๊เจ๊บ้านคนเดียวแล้วพี่ก็กินเด็ก
เรื่องการนี้เขาให้คุณเลยจะ นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะอะระหังสัมมาสัมพุทโธภะคะวะพุทธังภะคะวันตังอภิวาเทมิสวากขาโตภะคะวะตาธัมโมธัมมังนัมมัสสามิสุปฏิปันโนภะคะวะโตสาวกสังโฆสังฆังนามามิมะยังพันเตติสรณเนนะสหปัญจศีลานิยาจามะทุติยัมปิมะยังพันเตติสรณเนนะสหปัญจศีลานิยาจามะตติยัมปิมะยังพันเตติสรณเนนะสหปัญจศีลานิยาจามะ
โมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะ
นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะ
พุทธังสรณังกัจฉามิ
พุทธังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ธัมมังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ธัมมังสรณังกัจฉามิ
สังฆังสรณังกัจฉามิ
สังฆังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ทุติยัมปิพุทธังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ทุติยัมปิพุทธังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ทุติยัมปิธัมมังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ทุติยัมปิธัมมังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ทุติยัมปิสังฆังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ทุติยัมปิสังฆังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ตติยัมปิพุทธังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ตติยัมปิพุทธังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ตติยัมปิธัมมังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ตติยัมปิธัมมังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ตติยัมปิสังฆังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ตติยัมปิสังฆังสรณังกัจฉามิ
ติสรณังกัมมนังนิตติตัง
อาหังพันเต
ปานาติปาตาเวรมณีสิกขาปดังสมาธิยามิ
ปานาติปาตาเวรมณีสิกขาปะทังสมาธิยามิ
อาเกนาดานาเวรมณีสิกขาปดังสมาธิยามิ
อภิญญาทานาเวรมณีสิกขาปะทังสมาธิยามิ
กาเมสุเมจัจจาระเวรมณีสิกขาปดังสมาธิยามิ
กาเมสุวิชาจาราเวรมณีสิกขาปะทังสมาธิยามิ
มุสาวาทาเวรมณีสิกขาปดังสมาธิยามิ
มุสาวาทาเวรมณีสิกขาปะทังสมาธิยามิ
สุระเมรยามัจจาปมดตานาเวรมณีสิกขาปดังสมาธิยามิ
สุราเมรยมัชฌัปมาทฐานาเวรมณีสิกขาปะทังสมาธิยามิ
อิมานิปัญจสิกขาปดานิสีเวนุสุติเนญญันติสีเวนะโภคสัมปดาสีเวนะปฏิญญาตสมาสีลังเวโสดาย
สาธุ
เดี๋ยวก่อนหลวงพ่อแสดงธรรมขอปิดมือถือก่อนนะครับ ทุกคนขอปิดมือถือนิดนึงเบาเสียงก็ได้แล้วก็ช่วยอยู่ในความสงบนิดนึงนะครับ เพราะว่าจะได้ไม่รบกวนเพื่อนผู้ร่วมปฏิบัติธรรมนะครับถ้าใครมีธุระส่วนตัวนิดหน่อยเดี๋ยวค่อยพูดหลังใหม่ ตอนนี้หน้าไม่ขอความสงบนิดนึง
So I often sorry, always difficult after eating, to chant and get your voice in shape. I often say to people when it's time to listen to the Dhamma, to understand this is a practice in itself. This is an important part of bhavana, an important way of cultivating one's mind and one's understanding. It's not just a question of simply sort of kind of sitting there and letting it fall on your ears, or sitting there and treating it rather like a lecture at school or university, because it's not designed for people to try and gather information. It's rather more a question of allowing some of the things that are said to take root in one's mind and to help one to eventually come out of one's suffering. Buddhism suffers a little bit, particularly here in the West, from being compared with religions as we know it here. And I think when the Christian missionaries went to the East and they encountered Buddhism, they made certain interpretations and assumptions, not all of which were quite true. And that's affected the way that some of the words have been translated. Chanting was translated often as prayer, where it's nothing like that in the Christian tradition. And I think people assume that Buddhism is a religion like all the others. After all, they see various ritual gestures, they see people putting hands together and bowing, and all of this, and the assumption is that it's just the same, just like what you would find in a Christian church or a Hindu temple or a Sikh gurdwara or a Muslim mosque. But in fact it's very different. And it's very different principally because when you make those gestures, you're not making them towards a supreme being. You're not doing it for someone else or something else to try and sort of gain some favor or make them happy or placate them in some way or another. You're making those gestures really for yourself. You're making them, yes, in front of the Buddha image because you show your respect for the Buddha image. You make them in front of monks because again you show your respect. But really and truly the effect is on you. It doesn't matter, the Buddha image, I don't suppose, will pay much attention to whether you show it respect or not. And a good monk shouldn't be too bothered about whether you show respect or not. But it's important for you to be able to do that. And it has a very important effect on you and your mind. And so many of these traditional observances that we have are there really to help you develop your mind. When we came, I've told you this many times, when we came to England with Ajahn Chah in 1977, and he decided that I and Ajahn Sumedho would both stay. I've learned since that, and he wrote it in his little diary he was keeping, that he reviewed his practice about 2 weeks after we came here. And he felt quite satisfied with what he'd done, apart from one thing. And that one thing had been that he'd not paid any attention to spreading Buddhism outside of Thailand. And so he decided that he must do something about that, and that's when he called Ajahn Sumedho and I together and told us that though he would go back for the Pansa, we were to stay. And having been told to stay here, of course the questions came up about what we should do, and indeed how far we might need to adapt
some of the practices and traditions that we've known and been familiar with in Thailand. And the only one that Ajahn Chah was really fussy with was the bowing. Chanting and so on, he said, well, it's not so important. But the bowing, he was absolutely determined should be preserved. And of course, it's so because of the effect it has on you. If you can't bow, if you can't give up something of yourself, then you can't take anything in. You can't absorb anything fresh. You're not open to growth and development. And Buddhism, really and truly, is the science of your mind. It's not really religion as it's known in the West. It's the science of the mind and development of the mind. It's a whole amazing method and approach which can bring you out of your suffering. Nowadays, people are alive to the whole issue of mental illness. Just a few days ago, I spoke to someone I hadn't seen for nearly 50 years. I hadn't spoken to her certainly for 49 years. And we were students together. And I remember she had a breakdown. We didn't understand much about that. We didn't understand much about what were behind her peculiarities. Now, of course, 50 years later, I learned that she's lived a life of mental illness. But nowadays, mental illness is acknowledged, it's treated. There's much more concern and understanding of it than there was in those days. We didn't really know what was going on with her. Nowadays, of course, people are very familiar with the terms of like depression and bipolar and all this sort of thing. But in those days, it wasn't the case. And when I hear now, as I do in some of the places I visit, like Brendan Prison, which is run as a therapeutic community, and Broadmoor Secure Mental Hospital, when I hear them there talking about treating various symptoms, various things, looking for ways of sort of patching the person, I'm reminded too of how some modern Buddhists speak of taking some of the practices of Buddhism, using them to overcome or to alleviate certain mental deficiencies and difficulties. Buddhism is just that. It's a way of dealing with our minds. The big problem, of course, for all of us, whatever kinds of peculiar mental traits we might have, is that behind all this, and because of it, we suffer. The Buddha spoke of the basic sort of mental illness as being dukkha. It takes many forms, this mental illness, and we're used to talking about people who have schizophrenia or depression or whatever. And of course we tend to look at those more extreme versions of mental illness and say they are ill. But actually, in Buddhist understanding, we're all ill. We're all mentally ill. And the Buddha is seen as the great physician. And what he taught, what he offered, is a way out of all of that trouble and difficulty. Nowadays, the people who are engaged in treating people with mental illness are increasingly interested in what Buddhism has to offer, and particularly the practice of mindfulness. Unfortunately, in some cases they don't really understand it, and they certainly don't teach it or use it, supported by the rest of Buddhist teaching, and particularly the Noble Eightfold Path. But there it is, what the Buddha taught is a way of dealing with our mental illness and thereby our suffering. Essentially, our mental illness arises because of not knowing, not understanding. Now, if we don't know, we don't understand the nature of things, what's the result? Confusion. We don't understand, and so we think. We think about this, and we think about that, and we grasp theories and views and ideas, and the result is confusion. And confusion is very painful, very difficult to deal with. We often say in Thai, well, keep going back. People think too much. And when you think too much, your mind spins. And as your mind spins, so you can't stop that, and your difficulty and pain increases and becomes more and more firmly rooted and established. What Buddhism offers is an understanding of this, a recognition that our whole trouble lies with our mind. And the only way out of it is to train our minds, to work with our minds. Every time I come here, we spend a few minutes practicing meditation. Meditation for us is the art of training our minds. It's the art of developing our minds. It's the art, ultimately, of shaping our minds and overcoming that confusion, replacing it with understanding, with knowing. This is what Buddhism means, knowing. Now, along the way, we have a whole armory of teaching and practices which help us alleviate particular difficulties we might have. Mindfulness, of course, is used for dealing with pain, physical pain, mental pain, dealing with depression, dealing with minds which dwell too much on one thing and become negative. Mindfulness is very useful, but it's not just mindfulness. Mindfulness has to be supported with a stable mind, stabilizing your mind, concentrating your mind. It needs to be supported with a degree of determination, and this for people with mental illness is one of the great difficulties, one of the great problems. There are two big problems. One is lack of energy, and the other an inability to see their problem. And this is very common. If I say that we are all mentally ill, well, some people will agree, and some people will not. When I talk about suffering, some people I speak to understand immediately. Say, we are all suffering. Oh, yes. And other people, if I say, we're suffering, we say, I don't suffer. I told you about the woman who came to one of my groups many years ago. And she said to me, I don't suffer, what are you talking about? So I said, well, do you ever catch cold? Oh, yes. Ever have any aches and pains? Oh, yes. Ever have a headache? Oh, yes. Ever cry? Oh, yes. Ever have a cough? Yes. And I went on and on, until I couldn't think of anything else. And then I said, and do you suffer? Oh, no, she said. People don't want to see it or acknowledge it. And in the same way, people with depression, people with schizophrenia, often just cannot see what's wrong. So we have to get past that. We have to be able to begin to see that there is something wrong, that we have this mental illness, that we are suffering. And that's why the Buddha put at the very head, the very top of the Noble Eightfold Path, right view, right understanding. Because you have to have at least a glimmer at least some inkling that things aren't right, that you're not right. It's not just that things aren't right, I'm not right. And if I'm not right, then what's wrong? Well, body is body. Bodily health is one thing. So what else is mine? And when you begin to see that and you grasp that maybe your mind isn't right, it's not reasonable to be angry or greedy or jealous or obsessive about certain things. When you begin to see that so much is going on in your head, then your attitude begins to alter. And the second part of the Noble Eightfold Path is right attitude. And we all have an attitude to the things that we do, the things that we see, to our everyday life. And you know how it is if you're not, if you're in a grumpy mood, I've got out on the wrong side of the bed in the morning, then everything is coloured by that. You carry that attitude, and you colour all that you experience with that attitude. And if you're feeling in a mean mood, then you're mean and difficult about everything. On the other hand, if you're chirpy and cheerful and you have that sort of attitude, then the sun is shining wherever you go. And that attitude, that inner attitude, is very important. We need to pay attention to it. And certainly when you recognize that your difficulties, that your illness is here in your mind, then your attitude changes and you begin to wake up to possibilities of change. One of the great problems that people suffer from, of course, with all this is not just anger, but it's impatience. We're so often impatient with other people, angry with other people, intolerant of other people and their suffering. Most of you know that the Buddha taught what he called the Brahma Viharas: loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity. These are high states of mind. And many people aspire to have loving kindness and to develop compassion. But you can't develop compassion until you can see suffering. And you won't see suffering until you wake up to your own suffering. Until you wake up to the reality that all is not right here in your mind. And then when you begin to see that and explore that, then what other people are up to, the mistakes they make, the quirks they have, the way they irritate you, your attitude to it changes. Attitude, tolerance, patience, loving kindness, compassion, all begin to grow and develop. And genuinely so. Not, I'd better be nice to the poor chap, or anything like that. But it's genuine because you're seeing suffering. You're seeing mental illness. You're seeing it in yourself, and then you can begin to see it in all those around you. Now, just as it's important to try and remedy the suffering of others with your loving kindness and compassion, it's also important to take that attitude towards your own suffering. It's very important. Increasingly, I think that a practice of loving kindness is a necessary thing for just about everyone. It's an odd thing that in forest tradition there's not much talk about loving kindness. At Wat Pah, I don't remember anything much being said about developing loving kindness or practicing meditations on loving kindness. I don't remember Ajahn Chah saying too much about that at all. And yet, he embodied it. And he showed in his own life that he was capable and willing to take on all sorts of people and welcome them and advise them and try to help them. And within that great body of monks he had around him, including Prabhupada like myself, there were some pretty awkward characters, but he carried it all. He carried it all because he understood. And when you begin to understand, when your knowing develops, then you can carry and take on almost anything. I have a picture of Ajahn Chah that he gave to my parents when they visited. And I remember Ajahn Manapa saying to me one day, he said, you look at that, and he looks like he could cope with anything. And really, that's where the teaching and practice of Buddhism should be taking you, to where you can cope with anything. But all this comes from understanding. And the practice of Buddhism is about just that, knowing and understanding. It's a profound and exact science. And all these things that we do in temples are there part and parcel of a training of your mind. I did want to say a little bit more really about the practice of loving kindness. In Theravada, for some reason which I don't really understand, there's much more emphasis given to loving kindness than, say, compassion. In the Mahayana, they go on about compassion all the time, and they go around, with furrowed brows, desperately trying to be compassionate. As I say, you won't be compassionate until you understand suffering. And the whole approach in Buddhism really is about that. It focuses on examining your experience, looking into it, and understanding its nature. From that, everything else flows. And towards that, everything else gives support. But nevertheless, loving kindness is a quality that we must pay some attention to. When we practice meditation, when we're doing all this stuff to try and help ourselves, well, let's acknowledge for a start that we are doing something for ourselves. Many people don't want to do anything to help themselves, they'll do almost anything to help others. But, we were brought up to think we shouldn't be helping ourselves, we should be helping other people. Helping ourselves is supposed to be selfish. That's how I was taught as a kid. But it's rubbish, really. Because if you can't help yourself, for a start, you can't help anyone else. And if you can't help yourself, then you're going to be in trouble. And when you do this practice, you must acknowledge you're helping yourself. You're doing something about your mental illness. And when you're dealing with anyone with mental illness, you need patience and tolerance. And you have to be kind. So when you're looking after yourself, treating yourself, you've got to be patient and tolerant, and you must be kind to yourself. Now, being kind to yourself doesn't mean you indulge yourself in all sorts and anything you want to do. That's not loving kindness. I remember at Wat Pah Pong there being some major problem with someone while Ajahn Chah was away. When he came back, he was told, and he transformed into this sort of kind of man-eating tiger in front of us. And later on, the next day, I remember him saying to me as we walked across the temple, loving kindness, metta, what metta, it's not like that. Metta, qua metta, loving kindness is firm. It is a pure love. It manifests as friendliness. It's kindness, but it isn't subtle. or soft or stupid. And you have to do that. You have to be that with yourself. You have to sometimes be firm with yourself. You have to make the effort. You have to recognize you've got to do all the work if you want to get out of this trouble and solve your mental illness. But there is still that element of kindness and tolerance, patience. So I recommend that everyone does some practice of loving kindness, certainly bears it in mind, takes it with them into all areas really, because this is a very difficult business life. And about 99.99% of the population is mentally ill. When you recognize that, well, it changes things a lot. So I think that's enough for me for now, and I expect we'll do some meditation practice at the end.
We're going to sit back for meditation for 10 minutes.
So sit up and close your eyes. And quite deliberately and consciously put aside all the things that you've been worrying about, and thinking about, and wanting and not wanting. Just remind yourselves that you're doing something now for you. This is a bit of time you're giving yourself. And in this bit of time that you're giving yourself, you are going to do a little bit of work on your mind. This little bit of work is the art of training your mind. So first we need a mind which is stable, or reasonably stable. So we must try to stabilize our mind, which means not allowing it anymore to go off here and there where it wants to, but to stay put. To be anchored. Free from all suffering. And let it be on the breath. just observe, look, watch, and then come back to your anchor, to being mindful and aware of each breath. And before we close, just bring to mind loving kindness for yourself. And loving kindness for the other people around you. Just simply recite to yourself, may I and everyone and everything else be well and happy. May we all be free from all suffering. And may we live in peace, contentment, and happiness. And you can open your eyes and be at ease.
He's my customer here, but he likes to talk in local. You're welcome.
the question this young lady is asking is focuses on what I was saying about Buddhism perhaps not being a religion, but rather the science of the mind. And this sort of discussion goes on and on. What is Buddhism? Is it religion or not? And I've been involved in this discussion many times, and sometimes it's quite important. So what I think really is that in some contexts it's religion, but in some contexts, mostly, it's not. And why I say that is, this is particularly because of my stuff in the prisons. Where does this fit in? And the assumption is that Buddhism is part of religion, part of chaplaincy. And that's supported by the fact that at some point in Parliament it was decided officially that Buddhism is religion. So that I kind of welcome, because it does give us an official position. Otherwise we'd be in limbo. But I often don't feel comfortable amongst people who are religious. I mean, with the prisons, the prison service has what is called the chaplaincy council, because at one time it was exclusively Christian chaplaincy in prisons here, but now it's multi-faith, and it's very good, really. It's quite an advance, and I applaud. We have a chaplaincy council, and I am a member of that. I represent Buddhism on that chaplaincy council. But quite often, at meetings of that chaplaincy council, I feel kind of on my own, because we're all quite good friends, I must say. We've known each other for years, most of us. And there's a Sikh, and sometimes there's a Hindu, and there's Church of England, and a Roman Catholic, and a Mormon, and we get on. We hardly ever discuss religion. I mean, there's things that are happening in the prison. We don't sort of debate what's best and what isn't and all that sort of thing. We don't argue about it. But sometimes something comes up, like, particularly the belief in God. And one day I had to say to them, look, I don't believe in God. The Sikh, he's often on radio, Punjabi Singh. He looked at me aghast. I do not believe in God. They all assume that we believe in God. But we don't believe in God. Buddhism is not a no. And that to me is really refreshing. I'm so glad. Because the whole God idea to me is a complete nonsense. I was brought up Christian, by the way, in quite a strict Christian household. So I got it rammed down my throat from a very early age. One of the first things I ever learned was the Lord's Prayer. I can see it as a serious restriction in one's development. It doesn't allow you. This is one of the big. There are several differences between Buddhism and these religions, and one of them is one serious difference is that all these dogmatic religions, they're all dogmatic. They've got a belief system, and you've got to believe it. And once you're in that, to some extent, it can be comfortable because everyone believes the same, and they sort of look out the windows at the rest of the world and criticize. But the problem is, they never come out the door. They never explore what's outside. And they can't. I mean, in some cases, they're really forbidden to do that. Catholics are forbidden. Muslims are really in there. And it means there's no room for development. And one of the first sort of revelations for me, when I started practicing Buddhism was an opening up. And I used to be an actor, and there's a marvellous line in Hamlet. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than I dreamt of in your philosophy. Hamlet's words to Horatio. And that had such meaning for me, because I could see, I can see I don't understand everything. There's an awful lot but suddenly I'm opening up to possibilities, which I couldn't as a Christian. And I don't believe Muslims can, and I don't believe Sikhs can, because you're in the box. And it can be very comfortable in that box. Amongst because you're all pals together, and you've all got it right, and the rest of the world is wrong. That's what basically they're all in those different boxes are saying. But there's no chance to explore. Even the former chaplain general of the prison service was an Irishman, and we were quite friendly. And he said to me one day, he said, he'd never considered sort of exploring. It was a bit late by then, he's sort of chaplain general and, a big cheese, and chaplain to the Queen, and one thing and another, and he suddenly sort of, never thought to look at anything else. Late in the day. But to me, I feel very strongly the importance of exploring, being able to explore. Opening up, and but keeping that, not shutting down.
You have that anchor in the stick.
Oh, you must anchor your mind.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that and that gives you security. But it doesn't mean that you stop or you put the blinkers on or anything like that. And I feel very strongly that the older I'm getting, I feel very strongly about this business of growth and keeping on growing. Because I have seen, occasionally now, in recent years, I've had some contact with people I was a student with. One or two of them have actually grown. But I went to a funeral some years back, and they didn't recognise me, of course. It was like I was invisible. It was great. And there were these 2 or 3 friends of mine. One who was at that time very famous, and we used to share a flat together for years. He didn't recognise me. Well, but watching him from that slight distance, it was like he'd not changed. He was older, grey hair, famous, and all that. But it was the same body language. And though I couldn't quite hear the jokes, they sounded as if they were the same jokes. And it's a sad thing. People do. But you've got to be, life is really should be a creative thing. And a lot of people just, get bogged down and don't grow and don't explore. Afraid to. You've got to be open. Even Buddhists, some Buddhists get like it. The old rituals, the old stuff, becomes like religion.
That's what I'm going to ask next. But then some people could choose to be open. Like they say, Christian could choose to open up to Buddhism.
Oh yeah.
They chose to. So perhaps it doesn't really come down to how each religion restricts themselves in the box. It comes down to the individual.
Well, yes. If the individual looks out the window and decides to pop out and have a better look, there's only a chance, and some do. Some of the Christian missionaries who come to the East have actually become very interested in what they've seen.
And with Buddhism, it doesn't necessarily that you have to convert to become Buddhist. You can just do the practice, right?
Well, you can. I don't entirely agree with that.
I have had friends.
Yes, I have too.
Yeah,
I go people.
they're Christian, but then they do practice how being mindful and knowing oneself that they picked up from coming to Thailand.
Yeah, I've seen people like that. We used to have we used to have a Catholic priest who was a bit balmy, but he was a nice man. And he'd been in Thailand for years, and he spoke very good Thai. He was as deaf as a post. His English wasn't very good, so it was either French or Thai at the top of your voice. and he practiced, but he didn't give up being a Catholic. He was afraid to give up being a Catholic. You see, there is that kind of fear there, and that you see in some of these people. So they will practice some Buddhist techniques, but they won't make that step. Now, I think that you've got to be able to make that step. I think you've got to be able, because Buddhism is about, for one thing, ultimately letting go of attachment, right?
Yeah.
So you've got to be able to actually let go of your views and opinions, of your whole belief system. Now these people can't do that. Now if they're still stuck there, Catholic, but doing a bit of meditation, a bit of mindfulness and so on, they're limited. They've got really, and it's sometimes said that you've got to be able to blaspheme. What blaspheme means? Blaspheme means to say something detrimental about God or a deity or a low brush or something like that. And I'm telling you, if you've been brought up a Christian, and the same must go for it, it's almost impossible to do that. And there are a lot of people in this country who take interest in Buddhism and so on, and they start sort of trying to say, well, there's a bit of God in Buddhism, or it's pretty much the same as Christianity, and they can't say this business about God is a really wrong coppers. They can't do it. But I believe we've got to be able to. We've got to make that break. I've had to do it. I could see that the conditioning is very strong, and it's difficult to make that break. But you've got to be able to, if your Buddhism is going to mean anything and progress. Or, never mind talking just about Buddhism, but your exploration is going to mean your quest, your journey.
You can expand.
It's not a journey if you're staying at home all the time reading the maps. You've actually got to sort of go and take your chance. Without any insurance.
With yourself as an anchor. Thank you so much.
Paul said that mindfulness doesn't lead to happiness.
Doesn't.
It said it doesn't lead to happiness. Instead, it led to bliss and equanimity, and that's why it's similar to yoga. What's your view on that opinion?
Who wrote this article?
It's in a magazine.
Who wrote
I
the
said
article?
I probably got the wrong view.
Who wrote the article?
I think it's called Psychology Today. It's a psychologist.
Was it the psychologist who wrote it?
I think so, yes. What do you think?
Well, you see, it's an interesting thing. There's happiness. Some of these things become crazes or big industries. So we're talking about the mindfulness craze at the moment. And I could almost talk about the happiness industry. Because people are very keen on happiness now. The government's been doing things, and the Prime Minister, very keen on all this happiness business. And that young man who sometimes comes here with his bestseller, The Happiness Equation.
Oh, right.
And it's quite a big thing, happiness. And some Buddhists are putting it around that Buddhism leads to happiness. And the assumption sometimes is that the opposite of Kwam Tuk, Ben Kwam Su. So the opposite of suffering must be happiness. But it's an interesting thing. I mean, it may be a small point, but I think it's a very interesting one. That the Buddha himself talked about suffering and the end of suffering. Now, is suffering and the end of suffering the same as happiness? And I don't think it is. And I think that happiness, what mostly we mean by happiness, is another trap. And what is our attitude to happiness, mostly? It's desire, isn't it? I want to be happy. And Buddhist practice isn't about wanting or acquiring, it's about letting go. It's a whole stripping away. It's like the layers of an onion, stripping it away. And that, that's very interesting. So, mindfulness, for a start, you see, this mindfulness industry sort of grabbed onto one thing. And from what I can make up, because I don't want to criticise all of it, because I don't know enough about the different groups and different people, because there's different lots doing this. Some of it is just plain irresponsible. Some of it seems as though it might be all right or capable of leading on to something else. But I was told, someone I know at Warwick University, medical school, was telling me what they've been taught. He's a professor or something now. And what they're then being, half a dozen of them have been trained as mindfulness teachers in 12 hours. They're 4 3-hour sessions teaching them 4 mindfulness techniques, one of which he thought sounded completely balmy. And when he told me what it was, it didn't sound like mindfulness at all. But, and they are now teaching this to students. And you can imagine, it's always the case that a teacher will teach a bit less than what they know. So it gradually gets watered down. So that, from what he told me, I find that a bit concerning. Because actually, this whole business of practicing mindfulness and watching yourself and so on can take you a very long way. And I don't think some of these people have a clue about what they're opening people up to, potentials of it, which is a bit worrying. What are you going to say? What's someone like that going to say to a student who comes to them and who's suddenly being opened up to all sorts of emotions? Because you see, what happens is when you are practicing, this is what people call vipassana. So you're practicing mindfulness, you're practicing these various techniques which lead you to observe yourself and your experiences more and more deeply. And what you begin to see relationship between mind and matter. You begin to see how your world is happening here. You begin to experience change. You will experience it. The knowledge of it is experiential. Or suffering, it is experiential. And when you have that experiential knowledge of suffering, it's painful. So people will then be saying, well, I thought I was meditating, I was feeling better, and now I'm feeling uncomfortable. But that is part of the process of gaining insight, you see. Well, if someone's only done a 12-hour course, they're not going to have a clue about this. Some of the others that I've heard about have been better. Some are just examples of blatant plagiarism. One group, I better not name these things, but one particular group, which was never known, a Buddhist group, but never known really for its mindfulness, put it on this course. And someone I know gave me lent to me, that's never taken back, the brochure, the literature that went with it. And it's blatant. Lifted out of Mahasi Sayadaw, bit of Mahasi Sayadaw, bit of this, bit of Ubakin, almost word for word. And all mixed up. That's the other thing. Mahasi It's like Yunopongno. It's a very definite approach. Ubakin, Goenka, and all that lot. It's a particular approach. They're not to be sort of mixed up, a bit of this, there, a bit of that. You don't do that. This is the point. But that's what I saw in this literature. So it's a bit alarming, really. You know, when you practice mindfulness, really you're practicing mindfulness with other things. And for a start, in Buddhism, look at that Noble Eightfold Path. Each part of that Noble Eightfold Path is prefaced with right. The word Samma has different meanings in different contexts, slightly different meanings. So some people will say it's about perfecting, perfect mindfulness or perfect, but actually it is right. And you can see this very clearly from right view. Very clear, the Buddha's talking about right view, not wrong view. And we do have wrong view. You know, it is the view that we have a self or a soul is a wrong view. It isn't true. Right speech, right action, right livelihood. It's clear that there is wrong speech and wrong action, wrong livelihood. Again, you know, effort can be applied in a right or a wrong way. Mindfulness. I mean, just think about it. You know, I'm pretty sure those guys I see in prison, when they were creeping through the bedrooms, nicking the silver, were being very mindful. I can't believe they weren't being very, very careful. But you wouldn't call it right mindfulness. And I remember too, I reading an article about an English mercenary fighting in Vietnam. This is a long, long time ago. And he was meticulous. And talk about, you know, I mean, the precision of that man in his life. You know, his whole life was utterly disciplined. Your average yogi is nothing on this guy. He wouldn't drink coffee, you know, spoil his aim. He was a dedicated killer. Everything was focused on that. And, you know, the care of his weapons, everything. Great care and precision. And obvious, a form of mindfulness. But you never call it right mindfulness. So they leave that out. And of course, I tend to call these people the psychos. But they're not good on morality. They're not comfortable with morality, really. And I can understand why, because generally speaking, morality is dictated by some deity or other. You've got Christian morality, and you've got Islamic morality, and you've got Sikh morality. And they're not the same. You've got Catholic morality. I mean, I remember reading a Catholic book once. I found it a lot barbon, so I left it there. And basically it was saying, you know, the first of the commandments that God's supposed to have given Moses was, "Thou shalt not kill." Well, that gets distorted all over the place. So in this particular Catholic book, it was basically, "Thou shalt not kill Catholics." Anyone else was fair game.
Really?
Well, I mean, and look at it. Look at the history of this country. The blood that's been spilled between Catholics and Protestants ever since the Reformation is horrific. The violence and killing that's gone on. And they're all supposed to be followers of Jesus Christ, who said, "Love thy neighbour as thyself." But, you know, so morality always gets distorted. It's of a particular kind. And usually it's, we in this box are all right, but those in the other boxes are not all right. They've got it wrong. And so I can understand why people are wary about morality for this reason. Again, you see difference with Buddhist morality. Yes, of course, the Buddha did give the precepts and so on. But look at those precepts. They're not dependent on the word of a deity. They're plain common sense. And it isn't, you know, you mustn't kill, but this lot's okay, you can kill them, or you mustn't kill people, but it's all right to kill animals, or there's none of that in it at all. Panatipada is basically abstain from killing.
In that commandments that you read from the Catholic leaflet, it's like don't kill Catholic.
No,
That's
don't
not-
kill other people. Catholics are okay. Just say don't kill Catholics, but the rest are okay. You can kill them.
Yeah, this is true. We're looking about
Really,
the...
they stated that.
Yeah. And now, in one, I always have a sort of look at what the other religions are up to when I'm in the prisons. You see, it's the only time I have anything to do with them. And one of the prisons I go to has the Ten Commandments on a poster, and it isn't "Thou shalt not kill." You see, that's old-fashioned language. You see, so they've got to sort of update it, because that's from the King James Bible. Thou shalt not kill. So, on this modern poster, it's "You must do no murder."
Manslaughter is okay.
You know what that means, don't you?
But actually it happened in the, what you call 100-day war or Rosh War, when the England here made the march to Jerusalem to make a war over there with Muslim. You know, all the Catholic, they have to kill everyone.
Yeah,
And then they said, if you kill the enemy, you're going to be with the God.
But then
They start from there.
But then
you lose
also
it back.
when Henry VIII
Yes.
created the Church of England and wanted to get a divorce, the Pope wouldn't give him a divorce, so he made himself head of the church and gave himself a divorce. And after that, we've got all this trouble in this country between Protestant and Catholics. There's one monarch is a Catholic, and the next one's a Protestant, and they're just, I mean, the killing that went on and the torture, you know, was just horrific. And it goes on to this day. Not in England so much, hardly at all in England, I must say, because England isn't very religious. But you go to Northern Ireland or Scotland again. I mean, if you're in the wrong prison in Scotland, there's Catholic prisons and Protestant prisons. Like there's Celtic and Rangers, Catholic and Protestant football teams. If you're in the wrong one, heaven help you.
No, but in original, like the original commandments, it just should not kill, right?
Oh yeah, it's plain. Thou shalt not kill. Do not kill.
And why they change it?
Well, because it's convenient. Or I presume perhaps God's told them, I don't know. This is another thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to Catholic school, and it doesn't sort of say, you know, which race or which religion you should not kill, but it just says you shall not kill. But I think the worst is the Conquista, when the Spanish went to Latin America. They did it. It's, you know, they pillaged the countries, and also the number of Indians, local Indians, they actually slaughtered, and that was well before Henry VIII, and that was the most, and they did it in the name of God.
Oh, I know.
They did it in the name of heaven.
I know about
That
it
was the
because
worst.
there's a very famous play about it called Royal Hunt of the Sun, and it's about Pizarro's conquest of the Incas and the murder of Atahualpa, the Inca king. And I was in it for months. I was killed.
Who were you playing? What were you? Who were you
I was
playing?
one of the Incas. And he was supposed to be ransomed with a room full of gold. I remember I was hanging the gold up. But the other of the commandments that they've changed. Also, I was always taught Thou shalt not bear false witness.
Oh, bear false witness.
Thou shalt not bear false witness. This is sort of Old English, but basically what it meant was you mustn't lie. Thou shalt not bear false witness is a way of saying don't tell any lies. I'll change that one. So that's now. You mustn't give wrong evidence. It only happens in a court, outside of a court. Anyway, I'm off the point, but the point is that people are suspicious of morality because often morality is set in these kind of irrational ways by deities
People who
or
hold power, like
people who hold
authority.
power, yes. And they will set it to very often suit themselves or suit what they want. And as I say, you don't see that with Buddhist morality. It has a logic to it and a sense to it. Yes, the Buddha did talk about the 5 precepts, of course, but they're not just sort of rooted in someone's view. It's plain common sense, and they are founded in a practice of harmlessness, doing no harm, which is very different. So, I mean, I don't know. I can't comment much more on that, on what was said there. But they are using quite a lot now, mindfulness, and with some degrees of success. I suspect in a few years' time it'll be forgotten about. But they are using it. I mean, to be fair, with the whole business of treating mental illness, it's a very, very difficult business. I go to Broadmoor. You might have seen a program about Broadmoor on Channel 5 the other day. I think there's another episode this coming Monday, but the last one was very, very sensationalist, really. And I thought that was a terrible shame because this business of mental illness is a serious business, and it's very, very difficult to treat. And once people are past the point where they can see that there's something wrong, it is very, very difficult. And so whatever you do for them, they will not appreciate it. They feel it's imposed because they think they're all right. And some of them are very dangerous people. And the fact that they are very dangerous people does not make them evil. They are ill. This was one of the things that annoyed me about the program about Broadmoor, because there was one particular person that they featured or they spoke about, and they had an actor act him out, and he was a young man who was in Broadmoor many years ago for strangling a little girl, and he escaped from Broadmoor, and within hours had found a little girl and strangled her. Another one. And he was sent back eventually to prison. Well, I used to know him, and he spent the rest of his life in prison. He was an old man when I knew him, shambling around one of the prisons I go to. Pathetic old man, mentally ill. He was a sick man, and you can't help but have compassion for that man. He'd done terrible things. There's no question about it. What he'd done was terrible, but he was mentally unwell, and you can't condemn people for that. You can only have sympathy for them because they suffer with it. It's painful. It's awful. Some people have a terrible time with it. And the people who are treating or trying to, over a long period of time, have been making an effort in different ways, experimenting, because not much has been known. And in the past they didn't have the drugs. Well, they've got drugs now, but they don't always know the best way of using them or what's going to be best for a particular patient. So there's a lot of trial and error, and it's very difficult. Particularly with people who are unpredictable, and it's very difficult. I have immense regard for people in those hospitals who work day in, day out.